We want to talk this morning about the question of, does God care what I wear? That may ring a bell to you. You may look at that title and that very slide in the background and say, I think I remember that. I think we heard that about a year or 13 months ago, and you're right about that. So let's talk about the need for such a study as this. The eldership, plural, that is, those who make up the entire eldership, here, both present and in the past, have requested a lesson almost every year. Long before I ever became an elder, the elders would come to me and say, we want another lesson on modesty this year. And there were times they would say, we want not only another lesson, that same lesson you did last year. Because I have several lessons, they all end up saying the same thing. I make the same points, just come at it from a different angle. But there have been times not only they would say, we want a lesson, we want that same lesson again. The current eldership is no exception. There have been times we didn't preach on it one year. Maybe it'd be 2 years between. But for the most part, for the last 30 years, there has been a lesson almost every year on the subject of modesty. It is the conviction of the previous elderships and the current eldership that continual teaching on the subject serves as prevention. There are problems at times over modesty or immodesty, but it is much worse in places where there is little or no teaching. If you think we have problems from time, take a look at some of the churches where there's nothing being said on the subject and things are much worse than you've ever seen. So we think that it serves as prevention, and thus we think there's a need for that. In addition to that, that first 2 points there are the primary thrust. Regardless of anything else, that's the conviction of this eldership. But in addition to that, there have recently been this year some sermons that have been preached around the country that have gotten some attention. And because of our global society, that is the social media, much of that is shared by many Christians around the world. And perhaps you have been introduced to some of that material as well. And so, particularly, a couple of 3 sermons have gained some ground, and at least gained some ground by attention. And these were sermons that basically said, this is not a direct quote, I've restudied and modified my views on modesty. And in so doing, they have said that we can't define the line as clearly as we have previously preached in the past. That we thought you could draw the line at a certain spot, and we've come to the conclusion that we can no longer draw the line where we thought we could draw the line. The thrust of the studies have been that we can't say that exposing the thigh is immodest. And that's the thrust of the material that has been presented. In addition to that, there have been social media posts, or at least comments on posts, some of you perhaps have seen, that have ridiculed the idea that one could be responsible for another person lusting. And so, for example, here is a young lady that's wearing a very, very short dress, and some young man looks and he has lust in his heart. The problem is only with him. She bears no responsibility at all. How ridiculous that she would bear any responsibility. Well, in response to that, I just cite Matthew 18 and in verse 6. It is possible to be responsible for leading another person to sin. There's been a lot of attention given this year, this summer, over the subject. If you just do a little search, sermons on modesty, Church of Christ, do that, a Google search on that, and you're going to find multiple sermons this year because of the attention on social media concerning the subject. That's not our primary thrust. Our thrust is the eldership thinks we need more material. So this eldership not only chose that we need to deal with the subject, the eldership, not just me, chose today we need to deal on August 3 with the subject. Let's start with this principle, that it's possible to dress in a way that is wrong. If that's not, then we just need to quit and let's talk about baptism being essential and then go home. Is it possible that we could dress in a way that's wrong? Well, let's look at Proverbs 7 and in verse 10. There we read about a woman who had the attire of a harlot. That is, she was dressed for her business. And that is, she's in the business of selling herself sexually to others. The attire of a harlot. The Living Bible paraphrase translates that she dressed seductively. We could stop now and say, let's stand and sing the invitation song, and we've accomplished something in the sermon so far, and that is, it's possible to dress in a way that indeed is wrong. So the question is, does God care what I wear? Is that true? And if so, what principles govern the clothes that we wear? What Bible principles are involved in that? Where is the line to be drawn, or can it be drawn? And furthermore, can you bear some responsibility for the sexual thoughts of others? Could you dress in such a way or conduct yourself in a way, behave yourself in a way that you cause others to have sexual thoughts about you? Is that possible? Those we seek to answer in our study. And so again, our question is, does God care what I wear? Well, let's start with this. If that's not the case, then anything goes. Now, I don't know of anyone that has preached the message, God doesn't care what we wear. I don't know of any Christian that I've met who would say out loud, I'm going to affirm God doesn't care what we wear. But I am aware of that message coming through quite often in things that we say or the way that we dress. The reaction quite often is, in essence, I don't think God really cares what we wear. If God doesn't care what we wear, that would mean there is no line to be drawn. Surely no one present would argue that. But if God doesn't care what we wear, that would mean that any clothing, no matter how extremely short it would be okay. If God doesn't care what we wear, then you get it as short as you can, and God's okay with that. If God doesn't care what we wear, then any clothing extremely tight, where it looks like it's been painted on, then that's okay, and God's okay with that. If God doesn't care what we wear, any clothing that you could see through and see anything through that would be okay. God would not care. And furthermore, any clothing that you wouldn't even think of dare wearing in front of someone would still be okay for someone to wear. And furthermore, no clothing would be okay. If God doesn't care what you wear, does He care if you wear anything? Wouldn't that be a logical question to ask? And as often we ask, if not, why not? If that doesn't follow, why doesn't it follow? Let's go further. Every one of us will draw a line somewhere. Every person present, every person listening online will draw a line somewhere. If you don't accept that any clothing is okay, or if you say, well, I think any clothing's okay, I just don't think you can wear no clothing. I just don't think that. You just drew a line somewhere, didn't you? You just drew a line. Every one of us draws a line. So here's the question, where do you draw the line? And when you do draw the line, you are expected to defend that. Why did you draw the line there? And when I say defend it, I don't mean stand up publicly and defend it in the pulpit as I would, or that you're going to have a debate over that, but I'm saying at least in your mind, you ought to be able to defend, here's the reason I drew the line there. There ought to be a reason instead of something arbitrary. So is your line arbitrary? Do you draw the line there, wherever you draw it, and you will draw one? Was it arbitrary? Do you have Bible principles for drawing the line where you drew the line? Are you citing and say, well, the reason I draw the line there is here's a Bible principle. Let's go further. How are you drawing your line? Are you looking at those Bible principles? Is it based on what seems good to you? You say, well, I draw the line right here. Well, why? Well, that just seems like a good place to draw it. Well, this person over here, can they not do the same thing? They put it at a different place, saying it seems good to them. It goes there. Why not? Is it possible that my line could be in the wrong place? You see, Isaiah 5 talks about those who call evil good and good evil. It's possible we could get confused. Some people call things scriptural that are unscriptural, and vice versa. Some things sinful, men say it's good, and some things good, men say are sinful. So men do get confused. It's possible my line could be drawn in the wrong place. Isaiah 5 so tells me. Now, with that in mind, let us move to a very delicate subject in the Bible, but it is a Bible subject, and that's the subject of nakedness. If there was no such thing as nakedness, this study would not even be needed. So let's talk about the principle of nakedness. Let's establish something we all agree with, even those that I've mentioned earlier who've preached some things and said some things and written some things that want to move the line at a different place. We all agree with this principle, and that is nakedness is shameful. Do you remember in Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 7 when Adam and Eve were found to be naked and discovered they were naked? We'll get to that passage a little bit later. They were ashamed. There is shame equated with nakedness. Leviticus 18 and verses 6 and 7 equate shame with nakedness. Let's just take a quick look at Leviticus 18. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother, you shall not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover, it is your father's nakedness. And on down the line, all I'm trying to establish is nakedness and shamefulness go hand in hand. There is shame in nakedness. Numerous Revelation passages, chapter 3 and verse 17, 16 and 15, and 17 and 16, establish the same principle. Now let's go further and understand that partial nudity is nakedness. Perhaps the word nakedness in your mind that you're thinking, oh, I know what nakedness is. That's where people like go to a nudist beach and they completely disrobe, and that's nakedness, and I am against that. Well, good. But that's not how the term is always used. Let's establish that partial nudity is nakedness as used in the Scriptures. In the New Testament, the word translated naked can mean complete nudity, but it also can mean partial nudity. Thayer says, remember Thayer is a lexicographer, he's not a commentator, he's defining words. Thayer says the word can mean unclad without clothing. Well, we all agree with that. We know what that means. The question is does it also include partial nudity? Well, same writer, same lexicographer on the same page says that the word naked can mean ill-clad or clad in undergarment only. In the New Testament era, undergarment covered much more than we think of as our undergarments. Furthermore, Kettle says, badly clad or not fully clothed. Adele and Scott say lightly clad. All right, what we've established is the word itself, we haven't even gone to a passage yet, but the word itself can mean completely nude or it can mean partially clothed. So we're driving at the point that nakedness could be shown and yet we still have some clothing on. That's our conclusion. So you say, well, I'm not naked. Look at the clothes I have on. But am I revealing something that is called or referred to in the Bible as nakedness? So let's go to Genesis chapter 3. So why Genesis 3? You say, we live under the New Testament era, and you are correct about that. And you say, well, now Genesis 3 is not New Testament law, and you're right about that as well. That is not New Testament law, but what Genesis 3 shows me is God's concept about clothing. We see the first time man tried to clothe himself, and we see that that didn't work well, and God thought fit to put clothing on man, and we see the use of the word naked here in our context. So let's get our Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 3. At the end of chapter 2, the text says that they were naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now, there's no clothes put on them because that doesn't happen until later. So I have to note in the margin of my text, they are at this point. It's a delicate word, and yet it's the truth. We're trying to be delicate, but they're nude at this point. They have no clothes on. All right, let's go further. So verse 7 of our text says that they were naked. They, after eating of the fruit that was forbidden, their eyes were open, and they knew they were naked. There's our word. What are they? They're still nude. They have no clothing. They do not have anything on. So what did they do? They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves covering. Some translations say aprons. Now following that, after they did that, well, I want to talk about that apron just for a moment. But I want you to notice verse 10, when God asked them a question, they said they were still naked. Not nude. They're naked relatively. They have some clothes on, they have some covering on, but they themselves admitted we're still naked. Now let's talk about this apron. This apron, or this, as worded in the New King James, coverings, what was that? Well, I cite 5 authorities here. The 3 in the middle are commentators. You say, well, commentators, I got that. But the first one and the last one, Gesenius and Brown, Driver, and Briggs, are Hebrew lexicons. They define the Hebrew words just like Thayer and others, BDAG, define Greek words. These all say that this was a girdle-like or a loincloth type of garment. The New American Standard translates it loin coverings. Loincloths, the New Revised Standard. In other words, they took fig leaves and they made them something to cover the midsection of the body, to cover the loins. They themselves admitted they were still naked. Verse 10. Let's go further. At verse 21, God decides to put clothes upon them. I often refer to verse 21 as divinely made clothing. Divinely made things are always better than man-made things. Divinely made clothing was thus. Look at verse 21. For Adam and his wife, the Lord made tunics of skin and clothed them. That's the first time they were said to be clothed. There was a tunic of skin that covered the nakedness. They were naked here, still naked there. God covered the nakedness by putting something on them that covered from the shoulder to the knee. You say, how do you know that? The text did not say from the shoulder to the knee. No, the text used the word tunic. So let's talk about this word tunic. Some of the quotations will be citing a Hebrew word. Others will be citing a Greek word. And you say, well, which is it? Remember, the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the very translation our Lord used, the Septuagint, noted by this LXX, that's the Roman numeral for 70, standing for the 72 scholars who put that translation together. So that's why this tunic, you may see some quotations refer to it in the Greek. Sometimes it's referred to in the Hebrew. The original ISBE article, that's the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, on dress, talked about this tunic. The word that's used here in that Septuagint translation, that it resembled the Roman tunic, corresponding most nearly to our long shirt, reaching below the knee always, and in the case designed for dress occasion, reaching almost to the ground. Later, the same article talked about, again, it was much like a Syrian garment that reached to the knee. So in the ISBE article says that this word comes from this word in the Septuagint, stands for and resembles and refers to a garment that always went to the knee. All right, let's look at Gesenius. He's a lexicographer. Brown, Driver, and Briggs. These are Hebrew lexicographers defining the Hebrew word. It's a different word. We're going back to the Hebrew text. It says it's generally, a tunic was generally with sleeves coming down to the knees and rarely to the ankles. See, that agrees with what we just saw, that a tunic went to the knees. Let's go further. Consider Fred Wright, Manners and Customs of the Bible. He said that the tunic, inappropriately translated coat, was a shirt which was worn next to the skin. It was made of leather, or hair cloth, or wool, or linen. In modern times, usually of cotton. The simplest form of it was without sleeves and reached to the knees and sometimes to the ankles. The well-to-do wore it with sleeves and extending to the ankles. Women as well as men wore it, although there was a difference in the style and the pattern worn by the two. They're all saying the same thing, that a tunic went from the shoulders to the knees. So what do we see in Genesis chapter 3? We're trying to come to an understanding of nakedness and covering nakedness. That man was nude. No one would say they should go around that way. Man himself said, you know what, I don't need to go around this way. I'm going to cover some nakedness. And so they did. They covered some nakedness, but they were still naked. And God put clothes and put it from the shoulder to the knee. Let's draw some conclusions from that we just learned. Here's the first thing I have to conclude from that man was naked and he attempted to clothe himself. No one would disagree with us on that, would they? Secondly, man's attempt did not cover enough. You say, how do you know? Because God decided to put more clothes on. That's how I know that. Thirdly, God made clothing that covered from the shoulder to the knee. That's it within the word tunic. There's something else I learned from that. God put proper clothing on the man as well as the woman. Now let me footnote. There are some of our brethren who have this concept that any principle of modesty applies to women and only to women and doesn't apply to men. Well, it's interesting to me that when God decided to put clothes on them, He made a garment for the man and He made a garment for the woman. He put it on both of them. Seems like God has a better idea than man. Now let's talk about something that has become a touching point or an issue point. So let's work on this concept. Let's talk about the thigh is part of nakedness that is to be covered. How do I know that? Well, let's consider the fact that exposing the thigh is exposing one's nakedness. Let's go back to Genesis 3 where we just were. That when the thigh is exposed, that is equated with nakedness. In Genesis chapter 3, well, you're not even going to turn and read that. You'll remember the story. They were naked. They covered the midsection of the body, much like we would think of as jogging shorts, and a loincloth. The thigh is still exposed, and their nakedness was not covered. How do I know? They admitted it, verse 10, we were still naked. Here's another passage. You might put a marker or a finger here at the book of Exodus because we're going to talk about Exodus and the controversy that is centered around recent discussion of Exodus chapter 28. This is the garments for the priest. You say, wait a minute. This is not New Testament law. You got it. You got it. That's right. You say, we don't live under Exodus. You're right. We're not wearing priest garments. I got that. We're looking at this to define nakedness. Nakedness has not changed. God's law may change from the Old Testament and does to the New Testament. Who may be priest, what they should wear, but nakedness hasn't changed. We're looking for a definition of nakedness. In the garments that were made for the priest, look at verse 42, you shall make them linen trousers to cover their nakedness. All right, their nakedness needs to be covered. They shall reach from the waist to the thigh. They shall reach from the waist to the thigh. The thigh was included in their nakedness. We'll look at that construction from to here in just a moment. Let's add another passage. Let's go to the book of Isaiah. Now, none of these passages are talking about the New Testament Christian and saying to them, you need to wear garments that go to a certain spot. That's not what we're citing. What we're citing are passages that are defining nakedness for us. Let's go to Isaiah 47. This is talking about God dealing with Babylon, not even talking about a literal woman, but picturing Babylon as a woman. And what does he say about Babylon? He said, remove the veil, I'm reading it verse 2, take off the skirt, uncover the thigh. Pass through the rivers, your nakedness shall be uncovered. When the thigh is exposed, I'm going to expose you. I'm going to lift your skirt and embarrass you, is what God's saying. I'm going to raise your skirt and embarrass you to the world. Let people see. Now, is he talking about a literal woman? No, he's calling Babylon a woman. This is what I'm going to do to Babylon. I'm going to raise her skirt and expose her thigh. And the world's going to see your nakedness. The thigh being exposed was equated with nakedness. Now, let's go back to Exodus 42. And perhaps you've been treated to some of this, maybe on the internet. Maybe you've seen some discussion that some are drawing the line too far, you're being told. And because this word here, or this idea of the thighs, that it doesn't include what we think of as the thigh. What I want you to see is this from to construction includes all that is named within that description. Here's what I mean by that. I'm not going to go through every one of these passages, but let me just give you a sampling of that. Let's go to Genesis 11. Let's look at 3 or 4 of these just quickly. Go to Genesis chapter 11 with me and look at verse 31. Speaking of Abraham and Terah, that he was to go from the Ur of the Chaldees to the land of Canaan. That from to construction, like we have from the waist to the thighs, includes and encompasses all that is named within that. So the nakedness from the waist to the thighs encompasses all of the thigh. That's my point I'm trying to make. That's the nature of the construction of the language. Let's go to another passage. Let's go to Exodus chapter 11, if you will. Exodus 11. Notice 1 or 2 more of these. Verses 4 and 5. This is a good illustration. Exodus 12 will do the same thing, and we'll just stop with that one, and you can look at these other passages in your own time. But look at verse 4. He said, Moses said, and at midnight, this is the announcement of the 10th plague and the establishment of the Passover, etc. And at midnight, all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the maidservant. See, that encompasses the whole region. Same thing in Exodus 12, same thing in Numbers 4, same thing in Jeremiah 31, same thing in all of these passages. So here's the point. The idea of from the waist to the thighs, it encompasses the entirety of the thigh. Let's talk about the arguments that are being made. You need to be familiar with this. The word from which the word thigh comes is the Hebrew word yarik. And you say, I don't know anything about Hebrew. Well, neither do a lot of people know much about Hebrew. But we can understand what is being said. It is argued that this Hebrew word yarik, the word for thigh, is used euphemistically to refer to the private parts of the body. It does not refer to that section of the leg that goes from the waist to the knee. It refers, euphemistically, we're told, in their argument, that it refers to the sexual organs. So if that's covered, then the thigh of this text is covered. That's what's talking about in nakedness. Well, it's interesting to me that most translations, and we can cite numerous translations, 30, 40, 50 translations, that render it thigh. That's interesting that those scholars thought the word should be translated thigh. Now, if it's used euphemistically, would that not suggest that the thigh is considered a private part and should not be seen? Wouldn't that be the conclusion? If God is using the word that we think of as thigh, the English translation says thigh, but it's used euphemistically for the sexual organs, would that not suggest that the thigh is not to be seen, just like the sexual organs should not be seen? And could the term be used euphemistically for the private parts when there's no problem in exposing the thighs? That doesn't seem to ring true. God used a term here that it's okay for you to show that, the thigh, but it's used to have reference to that private part you shouldn't be showing. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Let's go to Isaiah 47:2. That's a different word there. Some have made a big to-do about this is a different word, the Hebrew word shuk. And it is argued that this refers to the entirety of the leg. English Standard uses the word leg. And we're told that it refers to the part of the leg from the knee to the foot, not to what we think of as the thigh, but it refers to the calf of the leg. That's interesting. No lexicographer that I know says that. But now, look at this. Think about this for a minute. If that's the case, if exposing the thigh, and that's supposed to be leg, referring to the lower calf, is equated with nakedness, that goes further than any of us have ever suggested. The conclusion would have to be the whole leg needs to be covered, wouldn't it? You see, people are making arguments that go further. They want to loosen the restraints, but their argument makes us go further, more restrictive than what they had argued in the past. That doesn't make a lot of sense. No one denies that the word could be translated leg. It is, but interesting that even when it's translated leg, does it not refer not just to the lower portion? Let's look at an example of that. Let's go to Psalm 147. Go to the 147th Psalm. And in verse 10. This is an interesting use of the term. He does not delight in the strength of the horse, nor take pleasure in the legs of a man. You think that's talking about the lower calf or the strength where in what we think of as the thigh, where his strength in his muscle is? No one denies that Hebrew word could be translated hip. It is. Judges 15. But by the way, that word yarik and shuk are used in the same passage. Hip and thigh seems to be parallel, referring to the same thing. Hebrew parallelism, we call that. It's more often translated thigh, and we just come through Exodus 29 and Leviticus 7 and other passages deal with the same thing. It's used with reference to that part of the leg of the sacrifice that was reserved for the priest to eat. Now, if you take a leg off of a cow or a bull or any other animal, what part has the meat where you're going to eat? Is it on the thigh or is it down in the calf, down close to the foot? Think about that. What I'm learning from all of that is the arguments that have been made to offset that hasn't changed a thing about what the thigh is referred to in Exodus 28 and Isaiah chapter 47. So here's the conclusion. When a person sees your thigh, they're seeing your nakedness. Now, if thigh and nakedness are equated, and they are in Exodus 28, Isaiah 47, Genesis 3, then when you wear a bathing suit, when you wear shorts, when you wear a short dress, you have splits that give a peek of the thigh, whatever the holes in your jeans. When people are seeing your thigh, they are seeing what God calls your nakedness. If not, why not? Now, this is an interesting take from Adam Clark in his commentary. And you say he's a commentator. He is. He's commenting on 1 Timothy 2:9. Sound familiar? See, that's the passage that talks about women ought to adorn themselves in modest apparel. I won't read the entire quote. But he talks about garments that some of the Greek women wore. That basically was a garment that sometimes it went down to the ankles, went to the knee, and sometimes to the ankles. And then he talks about, and he uses a term here that talks about showers or discoverers of the thigh, that they would put a split in the garment so as to give a peek or a show of the thigh. And he said that only young girls or immodest women wore them thus. In other words, they wore kind of garments that gave a peek or gave a little glimpse of the thigh, and that was immodest people. Now, he's not a New Testament Christian writing, nor your old fogey grandmother. He's writing from the standpoint, this is the kind of garments that we're trying to expose the thigh. Now let's talk about the word modest. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 9. What we've seen is if God doesn't care what we wear, anything goes. We got that. We've seen the concept of nakedness needs to be covered. What's encompassed in nakedness? Let's talk about modesty and words that surround that. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 9 said, in like manner, women adorn themselves in modest apparel. And we'll come back to the rest of that verse in a moment. We're not skipping that. We've heard a lot this year about modesty is an attitude. And my question is, who denies that? We hear a lot about modesty is an inward thing. Who denies that? I don't know of anybody that denies. Modesty is an inward attitude. We'll talk about that. But the word modesty is attached to apparel. That women ought to adorn themselves in apparel that is said to be modest. So the idea of modest apparel suggests it's possible to have apparel that is immodest. Otherwise, why did he mention that? Let's define modest. What does it mean? The word modest means orderly, well-arranged, or decent. This is Vines. A well-ordering is not of dress or demeanor only, amen, but an inner life, that's been emphasized lately, I say amen, uttering indeed to expressing itself in outward conversation. Not just talk, but how you live is the idea. All right, what he says, it means orderly. Strong says it means orderly or decorous of good behavior. Remember the qualification for elders, 1 Timothy 3:2, to be of good behavior? Same word here as modest. It comes from the word cosmos. Say, I've heard that before. That's the word for world, having to do with the order and the structure of the world. Well-arranged. There says it means well-arranged, respectable, honorable, modest. Kubo and others say. So this idea of order, get the conclusion here. The idea of order, that's what the word means, suggests that God has always insisted on modesty and the covering of nakedness. God has always done that. God wants order. Now, the word means the idea of reserved, being humble, being respectable, being decent and orderly. And so you look at some of the attire of the modern day, and is it the kind of attire that is respectable? It's orderly, it's decent. More about that perhaps in a moment. Let's talk about a word connected with that in our same text. 1 Timothy 2:9 says it's to be with shamefacedness. This is the King James translation. Shamefacedness. I like the American Standard rendering of that. Shamefastness. The New King James uses the word propriety, International Decency, Sensible Revised Standard Version. It comes from a word which means, according to Vines, a sense of shame. A shamefastness, American Standard, is that modesty that is fast or rooted in your character. The word fast here doesn't mean speed. It means rooted, fast. It's stuck. It's not a modesty that's on the surface that easily moves, but it's rooted in your character. That you have a sense of shame. There are things you don't want people to see. That's the idea of shamefastness. Strong suggests it comes from a compound word which literally means downcast eyes. Have you ever been embarrassed? And when you're embarrassed, you don't look a person in the eye with boldness. You look down because you're embarrassed. It's something you've done, something that people saw, whatever the case may be. You don't look at them boldly in the eye. You look down. That's a sense of shame. There's another term that's used in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and that's this word sobriety, connected with modest apparel. Well, that's not a word we use every day. Are you exercising sobriety? You probably think of drinking if that's the case. The King James uses the word sobriety. The New King James uses the word moderation. What's this word mean? Well, it means soundness of mind, sound judgment, good judgment. Having to do with soundness, sanity, or self-control. In other words, good judgment says, I don't show other people what they don't need to see. I'm not going to let them see my nakedness. Now, when you take all those words together, it's to be modest, it's to be shamefastness, having a sense of shame, having good judgment. That makes it clear that much of the clothing worn in our society is not pleasing to God. If not, why not? So let's draw some conclusions now. What are some conclusions I have to draw? Well, I've already seen that the principles apply to the man as well as to the woman. Secondly, it applies when we stand, when we sit, when we bend, when we lean over. The thighs must be covered. Modesty applies to more than just the length. It would apply to it being tight, form-fitting, or see-through. That has to do with whether things are modest or not. So let's make some application now. Let's talk about ways in which one might be immodest. It might be my garment would be too short. Or it could be that it's plenty long, but it's way too tight, shows the form of the body. Or it may be too thin. Maybe you can't see that in the mirror, but as someone stands back, they can see through and see your undergarments. Or it may be cut too low. Or it may be too loose so that people can see within your clothes. Let's talk about clothing that is not modest. Let's look at two categories. On the one side, we have clothing that we would put in the category, it's modest because it shows I have a sense of shame. I'm using good judgment. I'm professing godliness. I'm trying to be careful toward others. On the other side, we have clothing that would be considered immodest because it's showing I have no sense of shame. I'm using poor judgment. I don't fear God, and what I wear could cause some lust. I don't have to put these in the categories for you. To which category would you put the swimsuit? Which category would you put cheerleading outfits that reveal most of the thigh? Which one of those categories would you put a real short dress? Where would you put that? Which category would you put the split dress in that exposes the thigh? Or maybe tight form-fitting outfit? Maybe the sundress, the low-cut blouses and the dresses. What about shorts that reveal the thigh? Which category would you put? What about jogging shorts? What about strapless dresses? Where would you put those? Which one? See, it doesn't take a Solomon to say, I see it goes in this category, that one. Which one? What about the swimming trunks for men? What about see-through styles? What about something that shows the midriff? What about the majorette uniform? Where would you put those? Let's talk about where this applies. Now, if the principle of modesty and covering your nakedness is true, the question is, why doesn't it apply everywhere we are? By that, it applies to sports, for example. There are a few brethren who have this idea that, I agree with you, preacher, preach on. That's exactly, we need to dress modestly. I wish you'd preach more. In fact, instead of once a year, I wish you'd do it twice a year. Man, we need that. And yet we go out to the sports and engage in playing tennis or basketball or swimming or track, and the principle goes out the window. Why is that? Why didn't it apply while we're playing sports? Same thing true with the wedding. Somebody will say, amen, preacher, preach on. We need to dress modestly, and yet then they get a wedding dress and the back is out and it's low cut in the front. See-through, whatever the case may be. And the principle of modesty goes out the window because it's a wedding. Why? Why didn't it apply there? Same thing with doing yard work. You say, preacher, I'm out in the yard and I get hot. One is the principle of modesty. If you went to the store and you meet your neighbor there, you need to be dressed, covering your nakedness, but you don't have to in the yard. Why is that? Why does it not fit in all of those? Now, there will be some who don't like what's being said. That's going to be obvious. There will be some who tune in and hear about the lesson and listen online. They'll be watching, and they won't like what's being said, and they'll try to dismiss. But I want to suggest that we can't dismiss it by saying simply we're not immodest. When we say that, here's what's often meant. We're not guilty of outright immodesty. We're not wearing those mini skirts or short skirts, and we're not wearing the short shorts and the swimsuits and going without our shirts and strapless dresses. We're not doing all of that. So we're not immodest. But what they may be guilty of is what I call respectable, and I put that in quotations, immodesty. Their outfits become short when they sit down and expose half of their thigh. They may be low cut in the back and in the front. They may be wearing snug and form-fitting that mark out their form for all to see. They may have the low-rise pants that expose too much, or the top is too short. The midriff is showing. And I want to suggest that both of those are immodest. Now, in our time that remains, I want to deal with one more thing that we haven't dealt with before. I've been recently asked, as some material is being published, in fact, this week, by a periodical among brethren on modesty, dealing with some of these questions. They ask if I would deal with the question of clothing in worship. And like an idiot, I agreed to write on it. And I did. And I want to share with some of that information with you. It's a delicate subject. What about clothing in worship? How we dress, listen to this carefully, how we dress makes a difference, including how we dress at worship. How we dress makes a statement of who we are. You say, I don't believe that. If you walk up to a man and he looks like he's got on a police uniform and he's got a gun on his belt and he's got a bulletproof vest and a badge, does that tell you anything about who he is? You see a man that's got this fire hat on and he's got his boots on and he's got gloves on, got an oxygen mask. Does it tell you anything about who he is? You say, well, yeah, he's a fireman. How'd you know? Well, wait a minute, you're about to say the way he was dressed. You go to a hospital and you see a guy that looks like he's got scrubs on and he has a stethoscope around his neck and you say, that's a doctor. How'd you know? What gave you the clue? Well, wait a minute, you're about to say the way he was dressed. All I'm trying to establish is the way we dress says something about who we are. If you saw someone with a priest collar on, does it say anything about who he is? You see someone wearing the Jewish kippah, the Jewish hat, skull cap. Does it say anything about who he is? Would you say, there goes a Muslim? Or would you say, I bet that's a Jew? If you saw someone wearing a MAGA hat, does that say anything about who he is? A t-shirt that says Black Lives Matter, does that say anything about who they are? You see, how we dress says a lot about who we are. So what about our clothing in worship? I want you to listen carefully because I'm probably not going to say what you think I'm going to say. But I do want to say this, all principles of modesty apply. Everything we just talked about applies in worship. If not, why not? It is possible to be immodest and yet be fully clothed. It's possible to be immodest and yet be fully clothed. How so? We had a guy one time that, not in this church, but a church I was with, where the elders were trying to talk to him about dressing a little better, about waiting on the table. He would stand behind the table all reared back in a t-shirt and toothpicks stuck behind his ear, both ears. And the elder said something to him about it, so a Sunday or two later, he comes in with a tuxedo and a top hat, kind of overdone. That was immodest. He was out of place. Would you think it out of place if a lady came in a wedding dress with a long flowing train and that's the dress she wore to church? We're not having a wedding. She just wore that because that's immodest. That's out of place. But she's fully dressed. That's the point I want you to see. It's possible to be immodest by things being too short. It's possible to be immodest by things being too tight or sheer or clingy. It's possible to be modest while we're standing, but revealing while we sit. You stand in front of the mirror and you say, I look fine. I remember something about a tunic covering from the shoulder to the knee. I'm fine. You sit down and half your thigh is showing, maybe. Let's establish the fact that our clothing shows respect that we have for what we are doing. The clothing we wear shows respect for what we're doing. There is no dress code that can be or should be established. The elders here can't set one. We wouldn't set one. All four elders would oppose setting one because we have no biblical principle for setting a dress code. By that, all men have to wear coats and ties, all women have to wear dresses. Can't do it. Would there be just a little inkling we wished we could? Maybe. Can't do that. You say, why not? Where's the scripture? But, however that may be, there are clothing or items of clothing that's not appropriate for worship. You say, like what? Well, let me be extreme. Would you be kind of distracted if I was wearing a clown suit? Now, there's nothing wrong with a clown suit if you're in a circus. Or maybe a Santa suit. Would that be anything wrong with that? I'm fully clothed. Could that be considered Yeah, here it would be. What about if I wore some of the garments that the Pope wears? You seen some of that? Would that be out of place? Fully clothed. What about the priest collar, the nun's garb? What if some of the women wore the nun's garb, the nun's habit? Secondly, let's go to Genesis 41 and in verse 14. Joseph dressed for the occasion. You remember the case? Genesis 41, when he went in before Pharaoh, that he went and shaved and changed his garments. Remember that? My question is, why? Why didn't he go like he was? He changed his garments because he had respect for what he was doing. And I want to tell you, David did the same thing in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 20 when he went to the house of God. He changed his garments. Why? Why didn't he go like he was? He was showing respect. That's what we're talking about, respect for the occasion. Let's talk about a general principle that we all acknowledge of what's appropriate and inappropriate dress for occasions. For example, if you went to a friend's wedding, you ladies, if you were to go to your friend's wedding, they're getting married, you're not, would it be appropriate for you to wear a wedding dress? Maybe it's a little bigger, a little nicer than what she's wearing, and you kind of upstage her. And you say, well, I don't think that would be. No, it's not appropriate. There is a general principle. What if you're going to a friend's funeral, a loved one's funeral? Would you wear the loudest outfit you had, the brightest yellow, and the most colorful and flowerful thing that you could wear? Would you wear dirty clothes? Would you wear a t-shirt that advertises your favorite ball team? You'd say, well, no, that's not appropriate. All worship should be decently and in order. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 40 with me, if you will. Let all things be done decently and in order. Decently and in order. The same word of being decent is translated properly. In Romans 13 and in verse 13, BDAG says, this pertains to proper in behavior, decent becoming decent as one properly attired. You say 1 Corinthians 14 is not talking about dress in worship. I got that. But it says our whole worship service should be decent and orderly. My question is, why does that not apply to the way that we dress for worship? We're simply talking about showing respect for worship, for respect for what we do in worship. All should be done decently in order. I've told several the story of my granddad in the days of deep poverty. Couldn't afford a suit, but he had a pair of overalls. Now, some of the younger won't understand what I'm about to say here. But he had a brand new pair of overalls that were starched to the point they'd stand on their own. Young people don't understand what that means to starch clothes, but you older women remember what that's like. They were literally starched to the point, I think some of us grandkids tried to stand them up and see if they'd stand, and they would. But nonetheless, they would stand on their own. They were starched, they were perfect for him. But his old worn out pair he wore every day, but he wore that best pair on the Lord's Day because of the respect for what he was doing. Trying to do things decently and in order. Now listen to this carefully. We need to be careful as we approach this subject. And that is, we cannot bind our opinion. While we might want to say every man needs to wear a coat and a tie, or every woman needs to wear a dress, we cannot bind an opinion. Neither can we set a standard that we cannot consistently follow. Some want to set a standard, and yet they can't consistently follow that. But listen to this carefully. We need to be careful as we deal with visitors. We may have a visitor comes in that's not dressed like we think they should be dressed. James 2 has got to come to play here. James 2 has got to come to play. That we do not need to make them feel uncomfortable because they're in dirty clothes or clothes that we think are not becoming of worship. Let's make them feel comfortable, make them feel welcome. Their clothing is not the biggest issue. It's their sin that we need to deal with, and they're becoming New Testament Christians far more than their clothing. We can look at them like they've got something hanging around their neck of a strange sort because they're not dressed like we think they ought to be. We need to be careful as we approach the subject. Now, one last thing and we're done. Let's talk about casual attitude and casual dress. From what we've been discussing in our study today, it becomes quite obvious that attitude and attire go hand in hand. Few, if any, would deny that statement. Our attitude, our thinking, and our attire go hand in hand. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that the looser, the more casual the attitude becomes, the looser our attire becomes. The looser our attire becomes, the more casual it becomes, the more casual our attire becomes. It doesn't take a solemn to look around and see that there are many places where they are quite casual, very casual in their attire, and that spills over into the entirety of the service. I've been in enough meetings to see that. I've done meetings for 43 years. I've seen that, and perhaps you have in your travels as well. The more casual the attitude, the more casual the attire. Now listen to this carefully. There is a difference in one dressing casual by choice and dressing casual out of necessity. Recently was told a story about a mechanic that can barely make it on Wednesday night. And when he comes in, he has his mechanic outfit on, he has grease on him, he's dirty, his clothes are filthy. But the brethren are glad to see him because he makes it to church instead of going home and changing clothes and missing services. He comes casual, even filthy, out of necessity. There's a difference in that and someone who chooses, I'm going to dress filthy just because I want to do whatever I want to do. There have been studies that show the association between how one dresses and the attentiveness of what they are doing. I can share with you a study. I won't cite the complete study now, but there was a study done by Adam and Galinsky, I think it was, reported in the ScienceDirect.com, where the study they were doing was they were having people do some lab work. And were they careful in their lab work? And to whatever degree they were careful, then they tried, let's have them put on a coat. And they called it a painter's coat. And they were a little more careful having the painter's coat, but nothing like they were taking that same coat and putting it on people and saying this is a lab coat a doctor wears. And wearing the lab coat made them more attentive to what they were doing in the lab than without the coat. Their conclusion was there is a connection between how we dress and how attentive we are to what we're doing. Somebody could sure cite a study, I'm sure, that says there is no connection. But this one suggests there is a connection. But we already knew that before we read the study, didn't we? We already knew that. We already concluded that from our study, from other things that we have seen in our study. Does God care what we wear? And the answer is, He certainly does. He certainly does. What He wants is our nakedness covered. He wants us to be modest. He wants us to dress in a way that shows respect for worship, because He demands respect. And beyond that, that's as far as we can go. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?